my talk, the good, the bad, and the cross-platform. Just by quick introduction, are there mobile developers in the audience? Can you just by show of hands? Okay, so quite a few. Awesome. Okay, so the point of today's talk is not to give you an opinion on one way or the other. It's more or less just to give you some interesting shares on things that we've experienced across the years and potentially to give you some pointers on which technology might be the most interesting for your specific project. There is another talk today at 5 to 4, I think by Zandor, on Can't Believe It's Not Native, I think the talk's name is. And that is essentially him taking a web app, web mobile app, and showing how performant it can actually be. So I would encourage you to attend that. Okay, so who are we? My name is Nico. I'm co-founder and the CTO at a company called Bluecode. We've been around for around 15 years, founded in late 2008, when we built the first iPhone app in South Africa, and I think also Africa, but I'm not quite sure whether we can claim that one. So it was shortly after Apple first made the iPhone SDK public to third-party developers for you to actually build apps on the platform. And we built one for the most unlikely client. They're called Creamer Media. They do 3 publications: engineering news, mining news, and polity. It's like a political publication. And the CEO was an ex-client of ours and said that they really want to have an app for their mining news publication because they have a lot of clients in the US and Canada and other mining interested countries. So we built an app for them, which was quite an interesting experience. I'll elaborate on some of that later. But we did manage to publish it in October 2008, and from there we basically started our business. Yeah, and we probably shipped, I think, in excess of 100 or so native and cross-platform apps since then. Okay, so why are we here today? Cross-platform is a topic and a conversation, a question that crops up for us all the time. So whenever we engage in a product or a development exercise, cross-platform is definitely one of the things that people ask. And if you look at this graph from Google Trends, you can see that cross-platform app development is definitely something that has garnered interest over time. Interestingly enough, if you overlay native app development over that, it gives a slightly different perspective, whatever you want to take from these 2 graphs. But there's interest in both, and they are still growing. So obviously, the first thing that people always want to hear is how can we reduce the cost of this project? Because native app is still super expensive. The talent is scarce. And unless you are building a hobby project or a charity project, cost still matters. It is still a driving force. The other thing also just to take into consideration is that cost differs over time. So cost might mean something different to you in the short term versus the long term, depending on which technology you choose. The second thing people really want to do is how can we speed up development? How can we get more velocity? How can we get more features out? And for every developer in this room, I'm sure you know that for product owners and stakeholders, more is more most of the time. The third one is talent. So where do we access talent pools for native mobile development? Where do we access talent pools for cross-platform technologies? Does it make sense to have a JavaScript development house build a fully native app? Probably not. You could probably leverage some of your existing skills in-house and do that. So that's just one of the things to consider as well. How do you get the most out of the team and the skills available to you? So just a quick recap of the most popular frameworks that are currently available in this arena. So the most popular one is React Native. Facebook open sourced it in 2015. It's a JavaScript framework. It has great features like hot reloading. It allows you to render native UI. So if you want to stay close to the platform and build something that feels at home on both Android and iOS, it's a great option. It's a very mature framework, and it's basically a JavaScript bit for React that allows you to then live on the native platforms. The other most popular one is Flutter, which is a Google project. You use Dart to build Flutter projects, programming language. Open source as well, released 2017, so only 2 years after React Native, so also quite mature, and it's been around for a while. And some of the popular apps that have been built with Flutter includes like eBay, Alibaba, Google Pay, and I think some of the ByteDance apps are actually also built on Flutter. Then we have a super interesting one called Kotlin Multiplatform by a company called JetBrains. I'm sure you all are familiar with JetBrains and the stellar work they do in terms of languages and IDEs. So KMM is a Kotlin-based framework. It's got very interesting features in terms of declarative UI that works on all the platforms. It's got easy integration in the sense that it's not an all or nothing with KMM, so you can bring in a KMM component into an existing project. You don't have to do a full-on KMM project from scratch. And that is also front-end and back-end. So you can do iOS, Android, you can do server-side, you can do also web and desktop with them. So quite a comprehensive framework. And I think it's just gone stable release in version 1.0. McDonald's, Netflix, Forbes, Philips are all companies that have actually built projects with KMM. So it is also a well-used and mature and battle-tested framework. Then there's another one called Ionic, which is a more web-based framework. I think it came out of the Apache Cordova project and basically superseded that. It's also JavaScript. It's got a non-native UI, so it's more of a SaaS UI framework. Think Bootstrap, Tailwind, all those kind of like frameworks in terms of UI frameworks. It does allow you to have access to native hardware, so accelerometers, push notifications, all those things work. Then we have .NET MAUI, which used to be Xamarin, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a C#-based .NET framework. Also allows you to access native UI. Also offers hot reloading, which is a great feature for speed of development just in terms of productivity. And then the last one, we have native script, which is a newer one. Also a JavaScript framework. Also renders native UI. It's got a bunch of pre-built templates. It's not as mature as any of the others, but maybe it's something you'd also consider. All right, so now the fun stuff. Some of the popular gotchas that we've definitely encountered over the years. The first being bundle size. So when you think about your app binary that you produce in the end and you ship it to the App Store, people download it, you will definitely incur a cost on bundle size. Depending on which platform you use, that your mileage might vary. The good thing is though that this is generally an upfront static cost, so you'll incur that cost once because they have to ship for Flutter, for instance, will compile into native library. They've got their own rendering engine. They need to ship all of that in your binary, and you need to get that to the client. So that's where your cost is. That will not increase sizably as your project increases. So it doesn't scale with the complexity or the size of your project, but it is that upfront cost. Depending also on what your product is, who your target market is, LSM, South Africa, obviously, we have people that are more conscious of data usage, download, depending on how often you ship releases. If you're going to ship a 2 meg app versus a 40 meg app, that has an impact depending on what your product is. So platform expertise is an interesting one. The build one runs, or the build once, run everywhere dream, obviously is the golden standard we all aim for when it comes to this technology. It doesn't work that way really in reality. At the very minimum, you need expertise on both iOS and Android, if we're talking about those two platforms, to understand how do the developer consoles work? How does the code signing work? How do I generate certificates? What are the App Store review guidelines? What is admissible, what's not admissible? How do I make this app feel, if I'm not going for a completely foreign UI, something like, I don't know, a Tesla app, which doesn't resemble iOS or Android's UI, If you don't do that, like how do I still make this app feel at home on the platform where the end users kind of expect that experience? And then you also need to know what's happening. So what's been released at Google I/O, what's been released at WWC, what are the new technologies, Am I going to ship passkeys for my users in the next 6 months? Those are all things that keep your app on top of mind, obviously. Performance is an interesting one. Depending on who you ask, the mileage also varies there. If you listen to a team like Shopify, who's most recently said they're going all in on React Native, they've done extensive work on optimizing a lot of the UI components in React Native and Skia animations to really make these things performant. Whether your team has that expertise or capacity or resource available is something that you'd obviously know. But interestingly, so they published a series of 4 articles on their move to React Native. And there was this one little snippet where they drew attention to when they won't actually migrate something to React. And the factors are basically when they're deploying anything to hardware that has older CPU, so anything, I think, less than 1.5 gigahertz in terms of processing power, they'll never do that. So they have a bunch of like point of sale apps, which I think run on a little bit less expensive devices. So that would probably be where they won't migrate. Anything that does extensive processing, anything that requires ultra high performance, or anything that does many background threads is their basically checklist of when they won't ever go to React Native, but stay fully native on that platform. The developer experience is also quite an important one. So the people that work in your project all day, what is a native experience for them versus a cross-platform experience? So do you have access to all of the instrumentation that an IDE like Xcode on the iOS side might provide? Can you do battery usage monitoring? Can you do network usage monitoring? Can you track zombies in terms of your memory leaks? So those are all quite interesting. And then what are your debugging capabilities just in terms of going into stack traces? If you're shipping a library, for instance, in the case of KMM, that's consumed into an Xcode project, what is the developer's capability to run, put breakpoints, inspect variables, and the like? The app lifetime and dependencies also has an impact on how complex this could be for you. So there's one app that we've worked on for probably close to 14 years now, the same app, same code base. And that has obviously gone literally from iOS 2 to whatever we are now, going through many upgrades, many iterations, adding and removing many dependencies. We've been in many situations where we couldn't migrate to a newer version of Xcode. We couldn't target certain platforms, platform versions on iOS because we had a dependency that was outdated and hasn't yet been migrated to even live in the latest Xcode. That then is a blocker on shipping new features. You have to do an extensive exercise to upgrade that. There is also, there never used to be, but then Apple brought in a timeout where they said, okay, we've shipped Xcode 15 like 12 months ago. There's a cutoff. You cannot submit any new App Store to the apps to the App Store past Feb 2025. And then you actually need to be in a process where you can ship that or risk missing deadlines and shipping your product. Support is also an interesting one. For instance, I speak a lot about Apple because I am more on the iOS side, but I'm assuming this all is more or less mirrored on the Android side. So when I talk about support, I talk about platform vendor support. We get the ability to submit DTS tickets or developer technical support tickets to Apple. So if we encounter a crash that we don't know or that we suspect is within an Apple framework, we can't figure out what a particular performance issue is, we can submit a DTS ticket to Apple. They have an entire DTS team that will then pick that up. They'll ask us for sample projects, stack traces, other evidence of what we think is going wrong, and they will investigate that thoroughly and can escalate that to the teams of the affected APIs if that is an internal thing, or they can advise us, this is what we think you're doing wrong, this is what you think you can do better to solve this issue. So that's an invaluable thing that you may not actually have when you pick up a project that is an open source thing, because those people are volunteers most of the time if they're not paid by a sponsored donor for that project. So they will address it when they can, if they can. We also have access to Developer Relations Manager at both Apple and Google, which can navigate us on changes they foresee coming in the future stacks of their technologies. They can help us promote products. They can help us address issues, particularly on the side when you have App Store review problems. So when there's a specific thing that's tripping up app review and causing your app to not be approved, we often have those people that mediate for us. And they wouldn't say it, but they kind of do it on the basis that you play by their rules. I'm sure everyone has seen some of the latest Apple shenanigans. And now they can sometimes be a bully, but you kind of have to be playing along those lanes to make sure that you get the best possible experience. We've worked on a Xamarin project before where there was an issue. We referred it to Apple. Apple found out it was a Xamarin project. They said, yeah, that's not our technology. Best you go speak to Microsoft. We spoke to Microsoft. They're like, yeah, that's an iOS app. Best you speak to Apple. And you get passed between the two parties, which is not really great for solving the problem. So that is something to consider. On the flip side, though, considering the release cycles of what we see in technologies from Apple and Google, if you are working on an open source project and you do encounter a problem, odds are that you could probably solve and you could probably find the problem and solve it yourself, whether you need to fork it or do a PR to the repository, but there may be an upside there in terms of just the speed that you can solve that as well. So just touching on promotability as well, and this really just speaks to being promoted by the platform vendors. So if you open up the App Store, you see App of the Day or like the top 10 games in Africa. These things can have a substantial impact on the success of a product if you're not a massive company that has a platform and audience where you can promote this. If you're a smaller startup or a small indie developer or a new product, they can drive significant traffic to your app and your platform, and they may really help the success of your product. So Apple, again, they really love promoting people that implemented all of the newest APIs that they're going to release in June at WWDC. So the quicker you pick that up, the more promotable you are, and possibly like the more airtime you can get from them. And then most recently, there's a topic that's become quite popular. So an SBOM is a software bill of materials, and this really comes from the bill of materials that stems from 1990s manufacturing practices, and it essentially is what it says. It's a bill of materials that make up your product. So where this is becoming popular in software is SBOMs can have you get greater visibility over your exposure to security vulnerabilities. So if you have a list of all of the dependencies that make up your product, if a CVE is issued to a specific library, it's very easy for you to see where I am vulnerable and if I'm vulnerable and like how severe is it. So I mean, if any of you have seen GitHub does this now, so that if you have a project, they'll do a depend about alert for you. So they'll say there's been an issue in this library, you need to upgrade to version 5 to fix it, and you can get those mails on a weekly basis. So OWASP is actually driving a product for SBOMs called Cyclone DX, which is an interesting initiative. So there's a couple of standards for these that would allow also machine-to-machine exchanges, and that really just makes it easy to keep track of the inventory and where you actually might be vulnerable. So to the point of native, if you start a Hello World app in Android Studio or Xcode, that is going to have a very, very short SBOM, if any. If you start up a React Native app, Hello World, that's going to have a substantial SBOM because you're pulling in a fair amount of libraries. Now, not to say that all OSS projects are severely impacted by security. I mean, we've seen Linux platforms most people host their servers on Linux platforms, which is exclusively made up of these kinds of packages. But you do need to understand how likely you are to be at risk there and who's paying attention to these things. So there was a super interesting story recently in the news about an engineer at Microsoft that was noticing that his SSH sessions took 300 or 400 milliseconds to initiate every time versus the 20 milliseconds it was previously. And he got really interested in why this is and started backtracking on the versions of his OS. And as he went back, he found that there was a very specific commit to a very specific library that caused this delay. And as he started digging into this library and the commit that caused this delay, he actually found quite a sophisticated supply chain attack by what most people are saying is a nation-state actor that would intercept any SSH traffic sent over the wire using that library. So not a super noticeable thing for most developers. I mean, you'd know the makeups of your team, but if someone in your team saw a 100 millisecond delay in their SSH sessions, would they necessarily, one, have the curiosity, two, the skills, and three, the time to go and find that vulnerability? So supply chain attacks are a real concern, and it is depending, again, on your industry. If you're in banking, yes, this is important for you. If you're in building the Fart app, maybe not so important. And then just some experience shares from interesting things that we've run into on a project basis. So there was quite a popular app that, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. So the product for this app became one of the one of the biggest distributors of Apple Watch in the world, purely because of this product. And then they're not a hardware distribution company. We did a deal in 2015 with Apple where we basically have this partnership where we are able to give away Apple Watches by using the product. And part of the negotiations included that we actually released so Apple Watch was released in 2015, and they obviously again wanted to punt their product, so they said, okay, we'll do this deal with you, but you have to have an actual Watch OS app that ships with the product. The gotcha with this was that Apple had this technology called bitcode, which is it's closely related to LLVM, so it's got like an intermediary representation of your source code, and then once you submit it to the App Store, they were able to recompile it depending on the architecture that the app was running on, which allowed them to do like app thinning and slicing, so your app got a little bit smaller and a little bit smarter. However, this technology was not available to any of the cross-platform tools. So this only shipped in Xamarin around 12 months after Apple Watch first launched. So had we been building our product in Xamarin, we would never have been able to ship this app and do the deal, which was actually quite time sensitive. Probably not something that's going to affect a lot of people, but there is something to consider in terms of the technology lag. So how long after your platform vendor releases a new technology will it be usable in your cross-platform or third-party tools and IDEs? So this is an app that we've built using KMM. So you see side by side here an iOS app and an Android app. It's for a little startup in Cape Town. They do industrial lubrication and fire suppression modules for mining vehicles. And so this app will talk to a little Bluetooth unit in the vehicle and allow the driver or the operator to control how the motor is lubricated and set some settings on the fly to have that running smoothly. So we did an experiment here and we built a KMM library. So the entire Bluetooth communication protocol we built in KMM, as well as a lot of the view models, and we share that between the two platforms. So we had two developers. So we had the Android developer was building the KMM view models and the Bluetooth protocol, as well as the Android front end. So it's native UI on both iOS and Android, and then we have the model, the view model, and the Bluetooth underneath. And then we shared that across the iOS as well. Now, funnily enough, that developer is no longer with us, and what that meant was that when the developer who built the Bluetooth protocol left, all of that knowledge actually left with the developer. And since only one person had built it, which is the upsell of cross-platform, there wasn't any real shared understanding or knowledge retention in the company. Had we had done this implementation on both the iOS side and the Android side, there would have been someone left in the company that also understood the protocol and knew how it worked. So after the developer left, he is actually in the audience today, a dear colleague of mine. I can say it was quite interesting debugging some of the issues that we had to fix after the fact. So there is something to be said for building something twice. And then just also, who is maintaining your project? I don't know if any of you have ever been to this website. It's called killbygoogle.com. It's quite an interesting page. So it's got all of the it's like the graveyard of Google products. So there's, I think, around 295 products on there. And Google has this tendency where they'll build products, they'll see if it works. It's a bit of an experiment. They're a very weird company. But then if it doesn't, they'll just kill it. And there are actually a lot of loved products on here. So some people cried very hard when products made it onto this list. I think AngularJS is on there as well. I've never been able to really understand like what happened to Angular, because it's sunset, but then it's not sunset. There's a succession of Angular. I don't know if I'm just misunderstanding that. If someone could clarify that up for me afterwards, I'd really appreciate it. But you need to understand who is maintaining your project and what are their motivations. Again, so if you take someone like Apple, for them, they have an integral strategy. This is the hardware we sell. This is how we make money. Like, we're not selling search ads. We sell hardware, Macs, iPhones, iPads. The software that accompanies that is very integral to our strategy. So odds are that they're going to support it for quite a long time and very well. If there's someone who's got a separate business opportunity that is not the software that you are using, you need to understand what that risk is and how that may impact you in the future. So, I mean, last week there was some layoffs at Google. I think they hit the Flutter team and the Python team, apparently. This is a quote from TechCrunch, I think about a week ago. It says, "Any hits to the Flutter team ought to terrify a lot of people since many businesses are built on Flutter." And well, you all know Google's reputation for killing products. A product manager for Flutter said that the layoffs affected lots of teams, but Flutter and Dart were not affected more or less than any others. Now, that means nothing to me. Like, I can't make any business decisions on that. I don't know if you can. But it is something that I would be concerned of if I had a substantial fleet of apps running on Flutter. And then I had this, it was a funny story. So I once started taking French lessons at the Allianz in Pretoria. And I had this teacher, Mr. Bunduki, and I think he was so disappointed in our class because our class turned out to be just bunch of people going there, and every night we took a bottle of wine when we went to class, and it more just turned out into a wine drinking experience, and not so much French. But the one thing that I will remember is he always said, "Le contexte, c'est très important," and that means the context is very important. So when you make decisions on what your stack is going to be, you need to consider the context, who you are and who you're building this for. So if you're a solo dev or a small team, you know, odds are that a cross-platform architecture is going to work very well for you, and you're going to be able to ship a lot of stuff with very minimal resources. If you are a FANG company or a big corporate and you have a lot of resources and you share those resources, so if you have a front-end team of React developers, it makes sense to also maybe introduce those into the mobile dev team. If you are a team that don't necessarily have the resources of those teams, and you can't really spend all that time optimizing and really because, I mean, to be honest, you have to put in a little bit of more effort to get a very nice cross-platform app compared to like a stock standard native app. So if you can't do that and that quality is really important to you, maybe that's not the way to go either. If you are a team, like I mentioned earlier, that could really benefit from the promotability and that could really help your product take off, maybe native is something you can consider. So just a couple of things then to basically take into consideration is the expertise of your team. Vendor reliability and support is very important. How much of the UI you want to customize? Do you want to live very close to the native UI? Do you want to go completely custom? Do you want to share that also maybe to your web front end? The framework maturity, like how often are you going to fix bugs in this? I think I saw there was an issue that someone opened on GitHub on React's repository saying, is React dying? We haven't seen any commits in the repository lately. And a Facebook employee actually replied, no, you'll see lots of commits from the Facebook team. It's just React is really stable right now, so there aren't that many commits. The framework capabilities, again, can you live close to the hardware? Can you consume the newest technologies? Security we spoke about, and then educational materials as well. That's super important. So back in 2008, when I built that first iPhone app, Stack Overflow was not there. Then it was still Objective-C. So has anyone ever coded in Objective-C? Yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about. So it's a very obscure language. It was only used for macOS, really. Like, there weren't books available. I ordered a book from Amazon. The South African Post Office being what they are, lost it. Amazon sent me a replacement. The Post Office, what they are, lost the second one. And eventually I got someone to bring me a book from overseas. I saw it in the office yesterday. But that was also interesting because Apple had super strict NDAs in place. Like, we couldn't talk. You were not allowed to talk on any internet forum publicly about iPhone SDK. You're not allowed to post anything online. Apple didn't have forums. Like I said, Stack Overflow wasn't around. You could only speak to people inside your own company. That was me. I was a person of one, so I spoke to myself. But educational materials, like, they do obviously make a huge impact in the velocity and the quality of the products that you can ship. So then lastly, I just spoke about this earlier, but considering the risk, if you take like a classic 3x3 risk matrix and you consider how significant the impact would be if an event occurred and how likely it is for that event to occur. So is native script gonna be around for 5 years? Maybe, maybe not. I'd put that on like maybe a low. Is native iOS and Android going to be around for the next 5 years? I'd put that on like a high. And then if it isn't around, is it going to kill your business, or would you just have the resources to pivot and create a whole new app, maybe migrate it piece by piece? So yeah, just an interesting point to consider when you do make your choice. And that is a wrap. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes, I'll start with you in the front.
So obviously you have a lot of experience with the Apple wave and all the changes. On the Google side, besides the retiring projects, Android side of the fence, as many challenges?
Okay, so the question is, just to repeat, a lot of experience on the iOS side. Are there similar challenges on the Google side with Android Studio and those technologies? No, I mean, both Apple and Google have gone from Objective-C to Swift on the Apple side, and then Java to Kotlin on the Google side. Now, obviously, there's a little bit more intricate changes when it comes to Kotlin and KMM. I would say on the native side, no, they're pretty even. Yeah, we haven't encountered something that's really like put the screws on us. We had 2 questions back here as well. Let's go.
Project-specific questions are always going to be a consideration, but over time, the question of multi-platform or native has kind of always been there, and it kind of feels like the trade-offs have been kind of similar. Are you seeing any trends in going one way or the other, moving more towards multi-platform, things moving more towards native?
So just to repeat the question, are we seeing any trends towards going more to multi-platform? Correct. Yes. Yes. Like I mentioned, the cross-platform question is a question that we get in every single app that we do, basically. I see a lot of value, so in that app that I showed earlier, like where we did KMM, it sucked a little bit for me because because that comes from Kotlin, it's just by its nature, it's a little bit skewed towards the Android side because you develop that in Android Studio and Kotlin, and then it kind of gets consumed in the iOS side. So you can do that, I think, well. It needs a little bit of more love. You need like a closed box, well-documented API that you can then give to someone and they can just consume. Like, I mean, we know strangers to actually doing that. It is a little bit like sucky for me that you couldn't at the time debug it. I think JetBrains have actually released a plugin that you could put in Xcode now and allow you to step and do like backtraces and whatnot. I definitely see the value in it. Like, 100% there's value, and I do think that we'll see a lot more of that as these technologies mature. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
What's your experience with cross-platform integration? How did you manage the Google versus Huawei split?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is how the split between Huawei and Google, I think that was because of sanctions, right? So they, like the US said, Huawei can no longer have Google Play services, and that meant that Huawei apps now had to go to their own app store, and you had to use their services for push notifications and things like that specifically. We haven't actually worked on any apps that have gone to Huawei App Store that we didn't just re-sign and submit. So we haven't done integration with their push service or any of the other particulars. So it hasn't been a huge impact to us, but I understand that it is quite a popular phone and make in the country. I also understand that not all Huawei phones are impacted by that. It was only like the ones that shipped with Google Play services got to keep it, but only newer ones were deprived of it. Yeah, so we haven't had that much experience, but we probably are going to ship an app that will have to do that in the next 6 months. So I'll get back to you. Anything else? I'll get to you now, Josh. Yes. Sorry, just say that again. So the question is, are there a lot of South African businesses that build critical apps on Flutter? I don't know specific. I mean, I can't give you specifics. I know of a couple, definitely, and I do know, like, I do have a little list of, I'm just cautious of time, of global apps that have built on Flutter, and it's extensive. It's not trivial. So yeah, it definitely has support and buy-in from serious companies. Yeah, no worries. Josh. That's an interesting question. So the question is, as a junior dev, what is better, starting cross-platform or native? I think cross-platform. I think it's interesting because I think it'll make you feel productive. So you can do iOS and Android at the same time, maybe web even. I do think that at some point you need to do a deep dive because it is important to understand each platform in its own right and what the intricacies are and what you can do if you really want to get close to the metal. But yeah, I mean, as a junior, I'd say start cross-platform.